Hello, and welcome to this fifth episode of the Mbility Talks, the monthly digital event organized by the EIT Urban Mobility, where all aspects of urban mobility are considered and discussed in depth. My name is John Paul Judson. I'm the Managing Director of Now More and moderator of these Mbility Talks. In the last episode on cycling policies, I ended up buying a bicycle and cycling to work every day. So I am curious to see what will happen to me after today's episode on MaaS, Mobility as a Service, Disrupting Our Cities. In this century, information technologies have revolutionized almost every aspect of our lives, the way we interact, consume, the way we work, we travel. Many new business models have emerged, and most notably, we have seen a big shift away from ownership-based to subscription-based models based on services. And mobility is no different. But more than a technological revolution, MaaS disrupts our conceptions of public space and public transport facilities. It raises fundamental questions on the utilization of public space, the coexistence of public and private transport operators, and the ease of access to mobility networks for the end user. In today's session, we are joined by key experts and practitioners in the field of MaaS who are in the front line or the hot seat in establishing MaaS systems. For every session, we will have an introductory presentation by a colleague from Factual, an innovation and strategy consultancy focused on mobility, followed by a perspective from a startup, and finally, a fast-paced panel discussion. The first session will be on the governance models behind MaaS. Then we will deep dive into one of the most contentious aspects of MaaS, namely data. And finally, we will aim to focus on practical case studies where MaaS has been implemented to try and encourage and inspire you to take up the challenge of establishing a MaaS system. Now, I propose to kick off this event with a question to our audience. What is, according to you, the biggest challenge to implement MaaS? You'll be asked to write a short text, 35 characters maximum, and together we will form a big word cloud that will give a sense of the greatest challenges facing us around the world. As we have people joining from across the globe, so buenos dias, good morning to our friends in the Americas, good afternoon to those joining from Europe and the Middle East, and good evening to those of you joining from Asia. During the event, we'll be running a few polls, and you're also invited to raise your questions in the Slido tool that you will find to the right of the broadcast. Bear in mind that if you go full screen, you will no longer be able to view the Slido. And we also encourage you to use the hashtag Mobility Talks and interact with the EIT Urban Mobility Twitter account. So, to kick off this session, I would like to invite Josep Laborda to the digital stage. He is the co-founder and CEO of Factual Consulting, an innovation and strategy consultancy focused on mobility. He will be giving us an introductory view on MaaS and sharing what kind of governance models exist behind the scenes. So, Josep, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps good morning or good evening to some of you. Let me start with the definition of mobility as a service, one that is as simple as possible. So what is MaaS? There are many definitions of MaaS out there, but most of them, or if not all of them, have the same ingredients, which are at least one single app that connects the user with a wealth of mobility options available around here, including public transportation for sure, then car sharing, carpooling, ride-hailing, micromobility, you name it, a wealth of mobility options. And importantly, it needs to have a user-centric approach, which means that it needs to make life easier to the users through the digitalization of technical and business processes that run behind the curtains, hiding the complexity of the whole thing to the users. And so it provides also planning, how to get from A to B in the city in the most cost-efficient, convenient manner, how to book and get access to all these mobility services, all these vehicles that are available in our cities, and how to pay for the whole thing. avoiding the hassle of owning too many apps, which is some of the things that MaaS promises to tackle, right? While the value proposition behind MaaS is certainly beautiful, and it has raised huge interest in the mobility industry worldwide, and we have today this well-attended session with people from around the globe, it is also true that there are many challenges that are still to be overcome, and today we will discuss some of them. Today, I argue that governance is the real cornerstone that will enable MaaS to thrive, and that MaaS will not simply happen if a level playing field is not ensured that is able to take into account the many complexities involving the management of mobility. So coming back to the definition I gave, which is intentionally a simple one, there are certainly some nuances, some subtle differences, depending who makes the definition of MaaS. For example, the UITP adds to my more simple definition that MaaS should ensure that active mobility and an efficient public transport is the basis of MaaS, right? Well, this is fair enough, but there are also some questions that go together with this assumption. For example, how can we efficiently combine public transport with these new mobility services? Is it a matter of providing only the right information on multimodal trip planning? I think it's not exactly all that we need to make MaaS happen with public transport as its backbone. What about paying for this multimodal mobility from a single app, including public transport? How about enabling private MaaS operators to sell public transport tickets and integrate with other mobility services? This is one of the unresolved aspects of MaaS still. I think this would certainly be a way to make public transport a centerpiece of MaaS, as we all want it to be. Also, many MaaS companies and MaaS advocates in general make the point, state that MaaS should be an alternative to having to own a car. But what about those users that have no access to new mobility services, that don't live in city centers where there's plenty of opportunities to ride a bike, a bicycle, a kick scooter, or simply where in times these services are not available or not feasible for all kinds of users because of the digital gap, because people having reduced mobility, the elderly people will not ride a bike, etc. So, or perhaps users have poor or not convenient enough access to public transport. So is MaaS a magical weapon making users leave cars behind? Also think of users that do carpooling or do peer-to-peer car sharing using their privately owned cars. So remember that. So my point is MaaS is not black or white. It shouldn't be black or white. We should avoid making bold statements and wait for things to happen simply because we think the idea is beautiful, is bold, is brilliant, and that the mobility ecosystem, including users, will adopt it just because it's a good idea. And that is where developing a good governance, that is my point, is that is suited to every city, to every region, comes into play, and there will sure be many shades of gray. So the MaaS, in my view, definitely not black or white. So what are the other MaaS building blocks that we need to consider besides the right governance, enabling the whole concept of MaaS to work? Well, there is technology, indeed, and we'll hear from some MaaS, well-known MaaS providers in our industry today. There are this open data and analytics, and we also have a panel on this specific topic. We need open interfaces to and between mobility service providers, and overall a good communication between the different players is needed. So all of these aspects, I guess we will have time to discuss with the panelists later. So why the concept of MaaS, in my view, in our view, is so challenging to implement? Well, there are many reasons why, but perhaps one fundamental reason, in my view, is the fact that mobility is such a central part of people's lives, an enabler to economic activity, and so it's considered a right by many people. And so MaaS, it's seen as a tool as well that can help public authorities better plan and manage mobility, address negative externalities of transportation, such as traffic congestion, air pollution, etc., and ultimately pursue societal goals in terms of equity, inclusion, accessibility, affordability, etc. But this will not simply occur. That is my point. Without the right strategy, without the right cooperation with the different stakeholders playing in this ecosystem, and that is in part because mobility is not only a right, but by many stakeholders is perceived, is seen as a business, and many predict that a very profitable business, in fact, some of the projections say. And for these players, also being financial having financial viability is also a must. So there are many critical aspects that need to be addressed in order to combine both main inspirations regarding MaaS from the public and private perspectives. For example, if MaaS is to be an effective tool to a more sustainable mobility with public transport at its backbone, shouldn't public funding be also available to some privately run mobility services that are aligned with that objectives of sustainability, efficiency, and so on? What if we would, for example, micro-subsidize trips using new mobility services, connecting more users to the closest bus stop or train station, for example? So in our view, integration in MaaS, besides governance, is one of the most important keywords, where ultimately those MaaS implementations that are able to tackle the complexities of integration of critical processes that I have mentioned before, booking, planning, payment, will ultimately be able to develop a sound governance as level for the maximum aspiration of MaaS, implementing policy that benefits both the public good, public objectives, societal goals, and enables innovation also at the same time from private players. So we come to the point to define how this governance for MaaS will be actually implemented. It used to be like this, where end users are still faced with public transport offering in cities and also a wide range of new mobility services. And at some point, there have been some new actors entering into play, namely the MaaS, what we call the MaaS integrator, who takes care of integrating all data, APIs, business and technical processes from different providers and makes the whole thing work. And then there is the figure of the MaaS operator, who is the one that makes MaaS work for the final user, right? So the question here is whether there will be public leadership or private leadership for these new roles that enter into play, the MaaS integrator and the MaaS operator. So if it's the private sector who takes the lead, it might well be the case where all these new roles are taken by private companies, but it might as well happen at some point the public authorities, the public sector takes the lead, or something in between. So I did mention before that, in my view, the best implementation of MaaS is that in which we take account all the levels of gray in between black and white. So the MaaS goals from a public perspective, I have mentioned a number of them: accessibility, sustainability, affordability, which are in a way the objectives of mobility from a public perspective in general, not only for MaaS, while the private perspective has different aspirations as to how to become a profitable business model from the private perspective, right? So to finish, some key takeaways, some food for thought for you guys to kickstart and open the debate today with the panel. In our view, we will see different governance schemes simultaneously playing in the market, from public-private partnerships, co-petition between different stakeholders that address specific market niche, but also walled gardens, as we are seeing already today. We cannot avoid that, and I don't think it's a bad sign. I think that seeing different ways of MaaS to develop in the market means that the ecosystem is alive and is embracing the MaaS concept. This is good news. The ask forgiveness rather than permission approach, which some well-known stakeholders have tried before, it has proved not to work. It has proved not to be the right way to validate quite ambitious business model by some of the players in the market, from some new entrants. So we believe it's better to build trust among the users and among the different players in the ecosystem. So build ecosystem, avoid monopolies. It's also critical to have a level playing field that leaves room for innovation at the same time, and makes it feasible that private parties can innovate and become viable services in the market. Access to the wealth of data that is being generated is key for public authorities in their endeavor to use MaaS, to leverage MaaS as a tool to better manage mobility, but also for mobility service providers to operate their fleets more efficiently, and know how the market is developing, where is the demand, and so on. I did mention before, but I want to stress the fact that public funding innovation at some point could be extended to privately run mobility services for the benefit of the whole ecosystem. Liability over the whole multimodal travel chain is one of the, again, the critical aspects, because if you take a multimodal trip end-to-end, door-to-door, taking different modes of transport, and this is offered by a MaaS provider who takes care whenever there might be an issue or problem. So that is another critical aspect that governance should address. There is a false dichotomy in our perspective from own mobility, own vehicles versus shared, as I have explained at the very beginning. And last but not least, very importantly, owning the customer, the user, is critical. Everyone wants to interface with the end users. Public authorities want to keep contact with their citizens, and also private companies want to interface with the users. And then MaaS operators come into play, also wanting to resell mobility service provided by third parties. So this is one of the critical parts that governance needs to address as well. So up to here, I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Josep. And you're already throwing some many concepts out there. One of them is that between the end user and the public and private operators, there are now MaaS integrators and operators, and it would be good to hear from one of those. Krista Hutala-Jenks, Head of Ecosystem and Sustainability at MaaS Global. So what governance structure do you think needs to be for MaaS to enhance the end consumer experience of mobility? Krista, over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for having me. So I'm Krista from MaaS Global, the world's first true MaaS operator. Been operating since 2017. I quickly wanted to approach this from the perspective really of the customer, which Josep also talked about. So the last decade, so the 2010s, was really claimed to be the age of the customer. And so for the age of the customer, it wasn't only that the customers would really have more power, but also they would have far more information. They would be far more kind of educated, as well as they would start taking a central role, even co-developing the different services. And I think that that's really at the heart of what MaaS is about. And it's about giving a truly another alternative. So us, for example, as a MaaS operator, so we we give the customer the power to have all of the different real-time information that they need, the ability to plan and also buy tickets and pay for their tickets or pay their access. They need that actual physical access. And so what we are concentrating on is also the monthly subscriptions. But so I think one of the underlying things that we really need to be focusing on when we're talking about governance is that in order to have the real true alternatives to as many customer segments, like Josep was talking about, there's a bucket load of different type of customer needs out there. In order to have really sustainable freedom of mobility, you need to enable the freedom of choice, as there's not a single one of us out there that can cover all of the different mobility needs that people have. And now, so the open ecosystem is really something that our company is truly based upon. It's one of our founding principles on everything. And so what I want to say here is that what we are seeing across the different markets, so we can talk about the US or the North America, we certainly see that you have some of the particularly private players that are trying to go for the rule the whole market or a winner takes all. Now in Europe, unfortunately, what we are seeing that the public sector in particular, or some of the public sector players, would like to be the one dominant player in their given region. And then you also have all the different players that are trying to build their own kind of vertical supply chains. Now, what we want to see is an open ecosystem. And I really want to highlight that open ecosystem does not equal a Wild West where there is no governance, where there's no regulation. But what is at the heart of the open ecosystem, that you enable customer choice. You actually enable, by adhering to the governance base that we already have. We have, for example, consumer rights. We also have competition law that are very, very clear, but not really fully applied in a horizontal or harmonious way in the transport sector. And those already give a very, very good basis of ensuring that we will have customer choice, but that also that in all of our given roles, for example, the public sector can ensure that altogether we move towards the societal good, for example, moving towards a more sustainable transport system. And so what do we really think that the customer deserves? Well, easy access to everything, to give them that choice and that they can choose, and also roaming subscriptions. And why do we think that? Now, I'll give you the final nugget of piece of information. Think about the telecom sector. Would we really want to go back to the times where there would be one local or regional tele operator that we could use, where we'd have to make this long distance call? Would we want to take back what, for example, has been considered as one of the big successes of recent years from the European Union, and having roaming even in the telecoms? So it should be really the user's needs that are guiding light, that are North Star, and that will also guide us in building the governance model that we want, enabling MaaS. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Krista, for that perspective, and you're also welcome to stay for the panel. I would like to invite Violetta Bulc, former European Commissioner for Transport and now Curator of Eco-Civilization at Vibacom SP. And I would also like to have Pia Karjalainen joining us as Secretary General of the MaaS Alliance. Welcome to you both.
Hello. Hello, nice to be here.
Hello. I'm also looking at the word cloud that is building rapidly. One of the biggest challenges seems to be pricing and behavioral change. And what I imagine, what I'm hearing now from both Krista and Josep, is that there are many, many, many markets actually inside urban mobility. Do you think that public and private suppliers in that market are equal partners, or do you think there is also some unfair situations in this urban mobility market that creates complications for governance of MaaS? So Violetta, maybe you'd like to take that one first.
Well, of course, knowing that I'm an engineer by profession, my reply will be depends on. And that's exactly what it is. Different environments, different cities, different countries have different setups for that, and differently developed public sector and also the MaaS sector. So I think this is a really exciting emerging new field. We should not be too hasty. I mean, 6 years ago, this was only a concept. And look where it already got in only six and a half years' time. And it became a global concept. And that's a big European success. We have to admit that. It started in Finland, and it's at that time, the Minister of Infrastructure, Anna Benner, we really pushed the concept first on the EU level and globally. So my answer is absolutely necessary is the cooperation between the public and private sector. I think there are many different roles that they can play. I think regulators will have a big job here to do if we want to speed up the implementation. And probably the biggest challenge is decoupling infrastructure from services and from solutions, and making sure that we have open interfaces, which was already mentioned in the opening speech. But not only between infrastructure and application providers, but application and service providers, and later on solution providers and networks. So we have many layers of architecture now in mobility as well. So I invite everyone that this could be well done only in an open integrated dialogue through participatory models, that we really get everybody on board, and then push together with the Commission and local authorities for a stable, open, and robust model that really allows then investors to come on board. We've heard today we need investments in MaaS. So definitely the answer is yes, there is a potential. Door-to-door service cannot happen only with one dominating player, as we've heard before.
Okay, and Pia, do you want to step in here? What's your perspective on this? Do you see that the market is unfair?
Market is not unfair. There are many things what we can do differently or better, but there is a good starting point. There are also some pain points. But maybe if I sort of like use also this momentum without talking too much about COVID, but what we have learned now during the past few months after the crisis and during the whole pandemic is that together we are really strong if we want to be. So there is so much good potential in that public-private interface and partnership, and especially private sector has been really demonstrating very well its agility to come up with the new innovations and new services on board. And also cities has been very much more quicker than we have ever expected them to be in adapting the new technologies and new services. So that has been really big lesson for all of us, that in order to make our societies and cities more resilient, what we definitely need, we need that public-private partnership there. Then if we now talk about context on the governance, I think we are also sometimes maybe overcomplicating things, because we humans have been already mastering this in few places. So maybe I could draw a parallel from here to, like, you know, typical Sunday market, what you have maybe in your village or your cities, when you have all the vegetables and bread and fruits and all that things what you need to buy. So basically what is the role of city? They are providing that infrastructure, they are providing that marketplace there. And of course you have certain regulation at place to make sure that the products what are sold there, they are somehow safe, and there is no market for drugs or any illegal copy. So setting some sort of like a basic standards for the operations. But then does the city need to produce everything from its own farm? Of course, they might be the most efficient provider or farmer of the potatoes, but they don't need to grow everything themselves. Can city have its own style to sell its production there? Definitely it can, but again, it's probably wise to complement it with other kind of service provision. And then the pricing. Is it really city's role to set the pricing? No, competition does that all. And then does the city need to decide whether we should sell apples or peaches? No, the user should be having that control over everything. So sometimes I think we are maybe even discussing too much about this governance thing. There are many things what sort of like happens automatically, but in terms what is really important is that we guarantee the basic access to the market, where we have that elements of data sharing, we have that access to market for new mobility services, and we have access to integrate the services. And Krista and Violetta were already talking about those points as well, but today there are some situations where some like public transport services, they are not yet cooperating too much with MaaS operators, and while they are in a position of that kind of critical asset or critical infrastructure for the integrated services, that is now that could slow down or hinder the development of the multimodal services. So there are some pain points, as I said, but also the regulation can be the tool there and really then help us through this also. Also going back to Krista's point, for MaaS, we don't want to have any kind of like regulatory Wild West. We need definitely regulation, but focusing on the right things and not choosing the winners and losers of the market.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, the open ecosystem seems to precede to some extent the regulation. How can you say on the one hand we need an open ecosystem and then afterwards some regulation, or would you say rather we start with regulation and that creates the open ecosystem? Maybe Krista first and then Violetta.
Yeah, like I said earlier on, so open ecosystem is not the opposite of regulation or having a regulative scheme already in place. What open ecosystem is really referring to, that within that that kind of framework that you have, or within that market, everybody plays fairly, and you also have access to others kind of crucial, whether it's supply or then it's, for example, access to their data. And I think that it's quite often forgotten about that we already have very good regulative basis. For example, competition law, and we have consumer protection or consumer rights. So all of this is already in place, but then we also need to remember the kind of the roles and the goals that we have. Obviously, the roles and goals for the public and the private sector, they're slightly different, but those two can fully coexist, and they should coexist. But we need to just remember what the goal is. For example, for the public sector, to some of the public sector players, for example, like public transport operators, is their goal to try and be the only MaaS operator or the only one selling, for example, public transport tickets? Or is their goal actually to ensure that as many people will use public transport as possible? And I think that the point that Violetta raised earlier on, decoupling, that might be one of the issues that we will have to start discussing unless this moves forward.
Violetta?
Well, very shortly, I think that, as it was already said by my colleagues, open system doesn't mean a chaos and a wild west. It means the place where everybody can come on board and play the role, can compete and have access, equal opportunity access to mobility services and to the markets. So, but we should not forget that road mode is, after all, a space where we're talking about human lives being all the time challenged. We're talking about safety. We're talking about market rules. We're talking about predictability. And that's where regulators come in. And regulators are absolutely necessary in order to, especially if we want to push faster, and it seemed to be a trend to move away from ownership towards the use of services. So for that, the rules need to be pushed forward. But I'd like to just briefly touch something that is going to be discussed, and it's very relevant for our discussion too in the next panel, which is the data ownership and the data as the new ocean within which MaaS is developing. And I'd like to bring attention to all of you to the challenge that's been raised right at the beginning of the development of this issue and has not been resolved. Currently, globally, we have three approaches to how to manage data. One is American approach, where corporations own everything, and of course the government can intervene in this case of security issues. We have an Asian model where state owns data, and we have European model where we really pushed for user-centric approach, and users own data and they decide if they want to share it or not. So this is going to be a big, I'm not going to say battlefield, but a big, really space for debates, how to go about, and it's going to be crucial for the successful, sustainable implementation of MaaS services and MaaS business overall. So within that, it's a concept not only about ownership, but it's a very much concept about where is the focus, who's, as you can see, three different models, where's the focus? And the third one, ethical disclosure. How, I mean, in this fourth industrial revolution, we are generating this massive, massive amounts of data. This big data is getting really big, but how do we deal with it? I mean, what kind of society are we building? Are we talking about new data poverty or digital poverty? Or are we at the beginning of the launch already thinking about building a really open democratic society where these data that are generated by consumers are then also used for the benefit of consumers, and they can be actually the managers of it? So it's a lot to do. MaaS has opened really Pandora box, and I think we're at just at the beginning of a serious discussions.
Yeah, that's a big Pandora's box indeed, but you're also making the link with data, so I appreciate that. Pia, as this Pandora box is opening, what would be then your sort of key recommendation for a city that is approaching some sort of governance model? Do you think that it's really impossible because it's so based on culture that, you know, all models can work, it just depends on the culture in the end? Or would you rather say, no, you really have to consider this or that governance model in particular?
Yes, so I think mobility as a service always requires quite a good understanding on local conditions, the demand, the culture, the supply, what is out there, and therefore I agree with Josep that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are also some really good city examples what we often like to refer. So for instance, I would like to point out the city of Antwerp and the work what they are doing there, really in opening that open ecosystem, where they have currently already many mobility as a service providers and services at place, and they also have licensing policy requiring the mobility and transport service providers to integrate at least with 2 MaaS platforms. So the point of view is really there in the enhancing the competition. And my background is in economics, and therefore I'm really looking also the regulation as a tool to prevent market failures or mitigate the market failures. In my thinking, that is the most important role of the regulation. And therefore, what we now need from mobility as a service regulation or governance is really focusing on prevention of the externalities. Discrimination, pollution, congestions, and taking care of the safety. But also, I would really encourage also cities to start doing things, because we often also forget that that our conventional transport, our current transport system is not perfect either. There is 27,000 people losing their lives every year in the traffic accidents, and there is a remarkable amount of CO2 emissions and all that. So when MaaS is really bearing the promise to make our transport system more sustainable, I would be less worried about doing wrong things or things wrong, and much more worried about doing nothing at all.
Okay, so positive words, and actually it's also important that we address some of the problems. One of those issues can be data, and we will be jumping into data now. So thanks a lot for having been with us on this short panel, but you opened, I think, a lot of eyes. So thank you to Pia, to Krista, and to Violetta for that exchange. I would like now to Thank you. I would like now to move on to the next part of our event, which is indeed focusing on data. So maybe to go to our audience with another poll. So we know that data is key to deploy MaaS systems, but according to you, what are the top 3 data barriers that prevent the adoption of MaaS? And so we shall see a little bit what the audience thinks. In the meantime, I would like to now introduce our next speaker, who will be introducing this session on data. Marc Figul, strategy consultant at Factual Consulting. The digital floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Let's start with data. Of course, the discussion on governance framework are indeed a very interesting aspect, but they are also quite dense, with a lot of new information and so on. Hence, I would like to start with a game, a typical game of finding the differences between 2 pictures. In this case, 2 different slides. Here in the first slide, you can see the main 4 differential aspects of MaaS by definition. First, integration of multimodal mobility services, for example, public transport with micromobility, park and ride with public transport, such as train or metro, and many different options that can cover all the user journey. Second, single application instead of several ticketing operations. The third bullet point is the best value propositions for users and a better user experience based on real-time data for route planner, fees, and other information such as electric range of motor sharings and data collection for developing a user personalization. Last but not least, the new business models that can generate additional revenues to the system. We usually state that MaaS is a user-centric system with the user at the central point, but indeed it's also an ecosystem based on data from mobility operators, data from end users, and an efficient and neutral regulation framework, which is an aspect that we would like to discuss today with the panelists. This is the other slide. Okay, here the same definition, but without data. Firstly, no connection, literally, no connection between public transport and micromobility services, for example. The system is not user-centric as there is no personalization. Route planning and the use of a single application is not possible for multimodal transport. And another important aspect is that a proper open data framework will lead to an innovative ecosystem. The question here to the panel is, with a low level of data integration, without open data, in a proper framework, with data with quality, with privacy and trust, are the cities missing a good chance for sustainable mobility? This is the question that I would like to ask to the panelists. And finally, the types of data, either real-time or historic demand data, can play an important role on the core business of mobility as a service stakeholders. For example, first of all, for improving mobility of mobility planning from the public sector, for example, based on real-time data to inform about traffic events, or to detect underserved areas based on historical demand data. Secondly, the optimization, especially in the situation, in the current situation and in the coming years, optimization of resources by public and private operators based on predictive analysis, such as a typical rainy day, or what happens in a typical weekend, or in a football match day, for example, in a city. And again, last but not least, the innovative ecosystem. To create an innovative ecosystem. For example, after the open data in London by Transport for London, more than 360 new applications have been created using that data. One of them is Citymapper, that offered the Citymapper Pass with over than €4 of discount that TfL's London Pass. Then here, the question is simple. The first challenge is, where are the limits of disruption? Is that an important barrier as well? And other important challenges, for example, the quality of data, of course, privacy aspects to meet GDPR, the need of a public or public-private neutral body for data management to collect data and so on. However, an important aspect that I would like to share with the panelists is a public-private agreement on data. Data from private to public sector, and the possibility to sell public transport tickets by private operators as a counterpart. Okay, so looking forward to hearing your opinions from different points of view.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, for this overview. I see that from the audience side, some of the biggest issues with data is lack of a regulatory framework, but also no interoperability between data sets, lack of data standardization. So some of these things needs to be clarified in order to have a good functioning data system behind MaaS. One of those players who's in the middle of it all is Jorge Tercero. He is CTO at Wando, and he will take us through a very practical example of having to solve some data challenges in Madrid. Jorge, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks, Jean-Paul. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this event. So I want to share with you this project in which we use data from both private and public data sources to provide a better value to the user. So we are right now in the process of integrating taxi for Madrid and Barcelona in our mobility as a service application. Let me see if I can turn to the next. Yep. So then, a central part of every mobility as a service application is the trip planner. The trip planner is this screen that I'm showing here, in which user says, I want to go from point A to point B, and then the system provides several different alternatives, several different modes of transportation. In order for the user to make an educated decision, we need to provide some data to the user, right? Typically, the most important data is time, how long it's going to take for me to drive to go to my destination, and money, how much it is going to cost. Okay, so now we're in the process of integrating taxi, and from our partners, the taxi associations we're working with in Madrid and Barcelona, we can get how long it's going to take for the taxi to drive from point A to point B and how much it's going to cost. But in the case of taxi, there's another variable that we need to take into account. Total trip time, it's composed of two parts. One is driving time, and the other one is pickup time. So how long it's going to take for the taxi to drive to me, to come and pick me up. The straightforward approach to this problem would be to go to the taxi servers, collect the location of the taxis, and then try to find the closest taxi to the user, and then try to route how long it will take to drive to me. That's an approach that would be really accurate and that would work really good, but that would be really, really slow. And as I told you, this screen is the bread and butter of every mobility as a service application. So we needed to be super responsive, and super responsive means super, super fast. So then what we did was to try to find a way to predict the pickup time. In order to do that, we used three different data sources. One of them is the historical data on location of the taxi vehicles. So what we're doing here is that we are going every 30 minutes or so to the taxi association servers. We are collecting the data and we are storing it in the database. So whenever the user makes a request, we have data that is at most 30 minutes old. And also, since we have all the historical data, we are feeding that data into an algorithm which is trying to predict right now, in this very moment, what the taxis are going to be, right? So now we found that we were able to have a good estimation on how many taxis are in the vicinity of the user and how close they are to the user. And then we have the next part of the problem, which is how long it's going to take for those taxis to drive to the user, right? In order to do that, you need to take into account traffic. Of course, it's not the same to drive a certain distance under very heavy traffic conditions or under very light traffic conditions. And here is where we found some public data sources that we were able to use. This project covers Madrid and Barcelona. And both the municipalities of Madrid and Barcelona are providing through their open data initiatives historical traffic data. Okay, so we were feeding that historical traffic data into the algorithm. So then we are able to produce a prediction of where the taxis are going to be and how long are going to take for these taxis to pick up the user, to drive the distance to the user. The system looks really good, looks really accurate. It's not yet in production. When it goes to production, there will be a third source of data, which is the actual predictions. We will be running these predictions, seeing how long it actually took for the taxi to drive, to collect the user, and then we will feed that data into the system to provide more accuracy into the future. So I think this is a good example of how we can use data from different providers, using public, using private, to end up providing a better value to the user. What we found here is that it was great that Madrid and Barcelona provided the data, but it was sort of hard to work the integration because each of them is working under different formats. There's a lack of standardization, I think, in the industry in general. I think there are some great initiatives like MDS and GBFS, but in the end, a complex mobility system can run a huge amount of data, and it would be great if we as an industry were working on more standardization initiatives. Well, I think that's all I wanted to share with you, so I'll let you, Jean-Paul, take over.
Thank you, Jorge, for this very, very practical example. And it is possible to solve data issues, but some still remain. And you mentioned data standardization. It's really definitely one of them that's coming up from our poll. But the regulatory framework is still the number one. And so to join you on the panel, I'd like to invite Laia Pagès, Executive and Scientific Manager at Carnet, and Luis Alegre, Mobility Director at the Metropolitan Transport Authority of Barcelona. Luis, Laia, welcome to the show.
Well, good to be here with all of you.
Great.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here.
It's great to have you. Luis, I mean, this regulatory framework, you're coming from a public administration. You're having to deal with all these evolutions in mobility, a lot of new players. How would you then approach a regulatory framework that would satisfy, in the end user's experience, but allow all these operators to grow and facilitate, enhance the transport in your city? What kind of regulatory framework would you go around proposing to your partners?
Oh, that's a tricky question. The kind of regulation that we are working on, we think that the regulation must be approach between the public and the private sector. I want to focus on data, not on regulations in that moment, Jean-Paul, because regulation, of course, is a question of governance. Is a question that needs to be understand different in the different kinds of ecosystems not only in Europe, also as Violeta both say in United States, but also in the centralized cultures like China or some other countries. And the way you face the governance of the MaaS systems is absolutely different. In the case of Barcelona integration systems of mobility, we are working together with first with all the private and public operators, trying to understand what we are going to offer to the people. And you must know which are your data in that moment. So we are talking about many things, but for me, data is as the blood of the system of mobility, digitalization. So the first thing we need to know is what we are going to offer to the users. Are we going to use the users getting a trustworthy, reliable, and data that means create a safe environment in all the steps of the data change? of course, data should be clearly laid out on the user's mind. So we must give the information and maps in a clear and easy way. And data should be easy to use everywhere. So we need data standardization. And this is a key point in the governance and a key point in the relationship between private and public. Because many private and public operators and MaaS, they don't have some of these key issues. They don't have a good protection of the data of the users, and that is a key question. You can be very, very good at something, but you need to protect the user's information. You need to give clear information, and you need to have a way to speak with the other operators in an easy way. So we are trying to do now this in the future, and we are now talking about a pilot in Barcelona, first between public operators, and in the future, in the next future, public and private operators.
Okay, I mean, but that's the thing. I mean, how do you create trust around data when it's really so central to the whole system? Everyone wants a share of it. You Laia, you're also representing different types of players. How do you view that relationship playing out in relation to data, access to data, ownership of data?
Well, these are two issues that are very important. I do work in a private public institution, so I am kind of the person to talk about it. But as Luis said, public and private cooperation in the MaaS deployment, it's crucial, especially because we are dealing with data, and there are two. I would say that maybe it's a little bit simplistic, but I would focus the problems or the model that we need to define. And Luis talked very well with a lot of truth about the standardization, because this is a very good point. But before standardization, we need to set our model, because there are different ways to go, and countries are different, and continents are different, because the models that we want as citizens and as a society are different. And this is a very big issue in data. I would say that there are two main points, as I said, with data issues. One is privacy at the user level. Luis already talked about it a little bit. Protect users, how the sharing of this data should be, etc. And this, from an European point of view, is completely different than from an American or from other continents. And the other point is exploitation of this data. What are the business models around it? Because some of this data has been created by public administrations, that it's very expensive, and we need to see what we do with that. So I would go maybe in these two directions. I don't have a solution for that, but since we are in the EIT Urban Mobility framework, I think that this is a great project to look into these problems and try to solve or try to go together for at a common model, and try to at the end standardize this kind of models at the end, what we decided among us all together.
Yeah, that's already a call for action for the EIT Urban Mobility. Jorge, I mean, you're also in the middle as a MaaS operator. Do you think it's possible to balance data privacy issues and at the same time enhancing the user experience?
Actually, it's not just possible. It's something that we just need to do. I don't think there's no other option. It's just what we have to do. How to do it? Well, as Luis and Laia said, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's impossible for me to state a solution here to this very complex problem. What we are seeing here is that there are lots of different points of view that we need to balance. Key here for me is to keep a North Star, which is the interest of the user. Now, in the end, this is not a competition between different agencies or different companies or public and private. We are all trying to work for the same. We're trying to work for better mobility for the users. Having that in mind, I'm probably a bit naive, but I am totally sure we can find an agreement. We need to work together. It's totally necessary to have public and private working together in here, and we need to have a clear playing field. Okay, we need to have clear rules under which we can all operate. And in order to set that playing field, we also need to work together. I think it's impossible for for just a public initiative to provide a regulatory environment where we are all happy. I think we need to work together in order to provide that environment.
And Luis, I suppose you would feel a particular responsibility on issues around data privacy. I mean, it would be a great risk that in some way a public administration would be found to be breaching that trust with its citizens.
Yeah, that's true. So we are thinking that maybe we regarding the steps of Josep explained at the beginning, we are thinking that maybe the data container or the data bin where should be in some way be kept by the public sector, and it's what we are thinking about, and all the other things could be private and things like that. This is more or less what we are thinking now. That is a way to give security to the people, that they can trust in all the chain, or the trip chain that they are going to do with different operators. It's something that we are thinking about, but it's not easy, because you need agreements with private and public operators that they give you in some way the data, and you keep them in a container where you try to where there are also the data of the users, maybe with a wall in the middle, and you connect these informations trying to guarantee the privacy. This is not the only way to do it, but in that moment is the way we are thinking about. Only the public sector be only in the question of the privacy of the users, and so the MaaS platform in the sense of the way where there are all the data and we lay out them there. That's the idea, but it's not sure we're going to do that. It's the idea.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't think anyone's 100% sure about how to play out MaaS completely, but you're highlighting something that, to me, goes a little bit in a way against the open ecosystem model that we've talked about in that first part of the session. How would you balance then this open ecosystem and at the same time, making sure that data privacy and other issues around data are respected? Laia, do you think that open ecosystem fair business rules can work, or are contractual agreements not enough, and essentially what you need is regulation standards to underpin all of this data infrastructure?
Well, as someone said before in the panel before us, open system does not mean a complete chaos. So there could be open system with a small regulations that could set the rules of the game, that users are protected somehow, and that the business models are not stopped because of lack of transparency and many other issues. But on the other hand, as Jorge said at the beginning of this panel, there is also an issue with different data models and data sets and so on, that it's very important to do these things in a coherent manner, and that everybody agrees on the way of on the kind of data that we have, and that at the end this can be used to build new business models, and that people can somehow give new services to citizens, so that we all at the end live better. No?
Yeah.
I think there are also some good examples in other industries that we could use. For instance, in the finance industry, they have this regulation PSD2 that provides a really specific regulation on how different financial institutions have to share data between each other and with third-party players. I don't know. I'm sure that there are examples around that can help us.
Yeah, I agree with Jorge. I agree that it should be But we need to understand that when you talk about underpin the system, or you say, Jean-Paul, to underpin something, sometimes you need some rules, some agreements between all of us to underpin the same. Because maybe we are underpinning things, different things. So we need, it's that why the first part of the conference, governance, I think is a key question also for data.
Absolutely, there is a governance on data. And I think that we are coming to an end, but again, I think that projects like the EIT Urban Mobility, where there is public administration, where there are research institutes, universities, as well as the public sector and the private sector, sorry, must be used as a way of moving in these directions together and finding models that work for everybody, or at least to find consensus and go towards standardization, because this is a very big movement towards a better society at the end.
Yeah, and it's also confirmed in the poll. I mean, it's not just a question of public versus private. There definitely seems to be an interest for the whole ecosystem to come together on a governance concept, also for data, because even between market players, data standardization is extremely important. So thank you very much to the three of you, Jorge, Luis, Laia. Thanks for having been part of this short but lively discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and so we've discussed the challenges, we've highlighted some of the issues, and now in the last part of this event, we will look at implementation, and hopefully this will also inspire and encourage you to take up some of the examples that you will hear from. I would like to now hand the floor to Martí Jofre, co-founder and managing partner at Factual, for some case study examples. Martí, the floor is yours.
Yeah, but I'm afraid I requested the right to present, but
the presentation is done. Okay, we will upload the slides for you. But please go ahead, and we'll get you the slides right away.
Yeah, so a pleasure to be with all of you. I've been asked to move from the theory and planning of mobility as a service to reality. I will make an overview of the history of MaaS, how it has been implemented in different places. It's a pity we don't have the map in front of us, but basically I was starting with the three, let's say, pioneer initiatives, one of them being MaaS Global and WIM in Helsinki. Also, in a similar period of time, we had the SMILE project in Vienna and the Ubigo pilot in Gothenburg. So all these, let's say, three approaches with very similar concept, we can say is the birth of MaaS. Projects have been spreading all around Europe during last years. I would say there are now close to 100 of initiatives that could be considered mobility as a service. I will highlight some of them, which might be interesting to analyze for several reasons. So let's say three I would say, interesting cases to analyze. One of them is Jelby, which were provided by the public transport operator from Berlin. We have Trafi with us right after me that will explain this project in detail. Second one is the national program from the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management from the Netherlands, which issued a tender for 7 different pilots addressing different use cases and segments of users, but collecting all the methodology and collecting on the same institution all the methodology to assess the impact and lessons learned of the different pilots. So we think this is a very good approach to launch MaaS. So first try and then analyze and build on that. Last example could be City Mapper MaaS. It was already mentioned. City Mapper PaaS. It was already mentioned before. Here, a private stakeholder like City Mapper tried to launch public transport ticketing together with other private services with a heavy discount with regard to transport for London ticketing. Besides, let's say, the risky economic decision on that, we believe it's not a good example of the kind of dialogue that we would expect between public and private stakeholders to build MaaS. A recent development we've seen in the last months, I would say, although it has been there for years, but now it's really getting traction, is the business-to-business model, B2B. So we can call it corporate MaaS. So the technology providers, some of them are mentioned in my slides, are selling the service to corporates which want to offer a mobility package to their employees to reach their workplace or travel for work-related issues during their day. So this is getting traction. Skipper just got one of the most sound rounding funds lately. And finally, I would say 3 more new projects that are coming up. So they are popping up all the time, but they are really good examples. UMove is a project between the Swiss Federal Railways and 3 different cities in Switzerland, so that the users can really make door-to-door travel among all these regions transparently. Also, shared mobility operators, private, are included in some mobility subscription packages. So very interesting. They are getting closer to let's say, the high levels of mobility as a service. Second one is Move in Brussels. It started just 2 days ago. I included it in my presentation just this morning because it's such new. It's a pilot that will start. It was just started. 2,000 users targeted, integrating also all the public transport offer and private sharing operators and taxis. And last one, another example from the Skåne region in Sweden. In here, the technology provider, IOMOB, is providing an SDK that is embedded on the public transport application. So automatically, it integrates any private operator that is plugged onto this open ecosystem from IOMOB. And the good or the novelty about it is that they are providing this SDK to third-party operators, even private, that want to commercialize this combined public and private offer. So it's not a public monopoly, but open to third parties. Quick conclusions. So I would say the disruption that was expected from MaaS is taking a bit more time than initially expected. One of the problems has been the business model. User adoption has been slower than many believed. And part of that is MaaS requires a big massive participation of users, and we are not reaching this stage. We are finding that normally the value proposition goes to very specific segments of population. Second point, it was discussed already, the technological challenge. Even reaching this, getting level 1 on providing reliable information real-time from all transport service provider, it's still a problem for many entities and cities. And last, very important, is governance. It's kind of the discussion on governance, and we had one today, is kind of stacking many initiatives because trying to pre-identify the final picture. MaaS is really a complex issue. It's local. And really getting there it's better to approach it on a smaller problem basis and learn by doing. This is what we are trying to do in Catalonia with this study that is combining public and private participants and will be presented in November 2020 soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Martí. Indeed, it's very difficult when you have to start with the big picture. But let's also hear then from Tautvidas Gilis, who is working for Trafi. He will give us also a very practical, concrete example. So Tautvidas,
hey,
over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Let me just take control.
And
yeah, should work. Great. So yeah, my name is Tautvidas. I'm product director at Trafi. I'm going to present some of the lessons and facts, basically being behind launch of like a biggest MaaS deployment which is Jelbi in Berlin. So yeah, so as a Trafi, I know that's our vision. Probably don't need to explain why is that important for this group of people. So let me just skip from that real quick. And here are some of the facts about the Trafi as a company. So even though we're relatively small, about 80 people, and being like a startup, we have like a long history of being B2C type of company. And I think we're bringing that knowledge and helping cities to launch successful mobility as a service rollouts. And besides, working with the cities, we have like an honor of being technology provider for some of the tech giants like Google and Lyft and Apple. And that's, I think, very important for us as well. So what we do, so we provide so-called Trafi MaaS suite that helps to connect all mobility services in a citizen-centric solution. And the solution can be explained in few parts, basically, white label application, the back office that helps to analyze and manage the whole service, and as well MaaS API, which actually powers all of that, and that can serve other use cases like powering the existing services with the important components, let's say like routing and public transport information and similar. And yeah, here is the key city-led mobility as a service use case that we are powering and that we currently can communicate about. So Berlin, Yelby, client BVG, we have running it for almost 1 year, a bit more than 1 year. Just recently launched Zurich for client SBB, and Basel and Bern following later this year. And as well, in a month or so, we're launching Munich with a client of MVG. But today I want to focus mostly about the Yelby, since we have the most insights and experience behind that project. So you can see some of the stats on the screen, but I think what is important that Yelby currently, to our knowledge, actually integrates the most transport modes and the most vehicles. And then we have a really nice playground to understand how that really is accepted from the user perspective. And even if that's our client public transport company, and then communicate and marketing that to the public transport users, we have a very healthy split between how many rides are being done by public transport and how many done by shared mobility. Currently being about 70-30. With the corona kicked in, we have about like 60-40. So on-demand ride actually is a very significant amount of rides. So what were the crucial parts to making that happen and then continuing improving that? So first, it was mentioned a bit before, but yeah, that mobility as a service actually is a bit problem or the concept coming more from the industry perspective and not from the user perspective. So for us, it took us quite an effort to really get deeper and understand, okay, so what people are expecting from the mobility as a service. So having a number of in-depth user interviews, sending the teams on the ground, trying to testing and experiencing the product, automating feedback. I think these all the parts very important to understand. And I think what we learned that at least in their beginning, people who already use shared transportation the most and the most actively find mobility as a service platforms the most appealing. So basically, the mindset is like, I'm using all those modes, so help me to move more efficiently with these modes and maybe find more modes that I haven't discovered yet. And when you look from that perspective, these guys already use like a huge amount of apps which are very well established, like Google Maps, like City Mapper, like official public transport applications. Like say in Berlin, we have Fahrinfo, we have VBB, and of course all of those MSP or mobility as a service apps. And what people expect in mobility as a service is to have all of those components or best components, all of those applications being represented in mobility as a service. So the list of fundamentals, what people expect from mobility as a service is like a really huge and quite wide. So frictionless onboarding, having complete set of MSPs, having the accurate routing results, and competing with the best players in the world, accurate and complete public transport information, like support quality, all of those parts that actually people expect. And then I think what we found is very important to tick all of those boxes before going deeper, and that's a pretty significant effort and lots of technology is all required to actually get to that point. And I think the last point that on top of that, even by serving those most advanced users, then we can create like a strong fundamentals, then we can provide unique value on top of that, and then help to get more segments into mobility as a service. So one of the most obvious ones probably was mentioned already is mobility budgets for corporates. If we have all those MSPs and if we have payments, we can help corporates to offer that sustainable option for the employees, and employees effortlessly being able to redeem that budget. And I think similar examples like this, or like family accounts, or if we could expand the mobility budgets to other use cases, I think these elements can actually help more people discover shared transportation, even those that currently are not using that. So yeah, so thanks a lot. I think that was the key lessons from Jelby. I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Tautvydas. I mean, we're running after time, but I would like Sami Sahala, project manager at Forum Virium on smart mobility, Tautvydas and Martti to join me for a quick panel session on implementation. Just a couple of questions. I'd like also to bring some of the audience questions here at this stage, because you were talking about some of the challenges and expectations of users on MaaS. One question that's getting some traction here is the role of MaaS also for suburban, rural areas, what they call mobility deserts, where there are less options. Sami, your experience in Helsinki, I mean, people always look up to Helsinki in these kinds of issues. Do you think there's a role for MaaS platforms to also support mobility in suburban and rural areas? Sami, are you with us? Okay. Maybe Tautvydas, you can just go for that one.
Yeah, I think directly mobility as a service application won't solve this problem, because I think it's not a problem of connecting the information. It's the problem that in that area there's no good transport alternatives. And I think where we're looking, at least I can trust that currently we're in a stage where we connect transport alternative transport option with the users and helping them communicate together. But I think one part which is going to be connected is like including the city governance or city regulations toward the same ecosystems. And I think like if we connect that and enable cities to, for example, incentivize mobility as a service operators to offer the mobility in the unserved areas, I think then mobility as a service can actually serve a very critical role in enabling cities to regulate and incentivize appearance of mobility as a service, and then the users in those areas finding and discovering those new options in an easy way. And I think in that way, I think those problems can be solved, but not in only combining the information that is available.
Okay, Sami, are you with us?
Yeah, hopefully. Am I?
I can hear you. Yep, it's all good.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yes, well, exactly like you just heard. It's not about mobility within certain different types of areas. It's more about the mobility between different areas. So even if you are in rural areas, in suburbs, you sometimes need to get out of there, come to the city, come to some other area for your hobbies, for your business, whatever. And that's basically where MaaS is. That's the key role for MaaS actually to manage that much better. And then from public sector perspective, it's not just that. It's not just the mobility. It is about keeping the rural areas alive, for example. That's the big one for many politicians. And so it's about livability, being able to live in a countryside without having to own your car, for example. So there are some political ideas and missions in the background, but why MaaS is a good thing for that.
And for some of the cities listening into us, Sami, can you just give us maybe your top 2 lessons learned from the Helsinki experience on MaaS?
Yeah, only top 2. Yeah.
Yeah, only top 2. It's too complex otherwise.
Yeah. First of all, don't try anything by yourself. It is a team business. You need multiple stakeholders to get that, and then don't do anything in a too hasty way. Don't just rush into things and put out a public tender and just buy yourself a MaaS, since that way you will not really know what you're getting. So there's a lot of choices, a lot of homework to do. Please do, when you make choices, make educated choices before you rush into things.
Okay, so partnership and planning.
Yes.
Yeah, to sum up. Marti, you wanted to jump in there.
Yes. Regarding this rural MaaS issue, there's something that we normally assume to MaaS, which is replacing private car and moving into shared mobility and mobility as a service. This is something that might be possible in the future, especially in downtown. But when you move to rural areas, we probably can expect the private car to play a role for many years. So sometimes we are neglecting the role of car, and MaaS can play a role here for these people traveling to downtown by car. And here I think MaaS can provide a way to stop the part of the trip by private car, the segment of the trip, and ease the interaction between the shift from car to public transport. There are many ways that MaaS can help in that.
Okay, and in Helsinki, people are still driving cars.
Yeah, and continue to do so. That's something we always get from say, journalists from, say, USA, that questions like, so are you disappointed that not everyone is using MaaS? Of course not. It's about having different options for people and making an impact 1% at a time, and that's basically what it's all about.
Okay, so that's also a message of hope. I mean, to cities that are just building a system, it doesn't have to work for everyone straight away, right? It's incremental change.
Yes.
Yeah. One last word from Tautvides on this.
Yeah, I think it summarizes that very well. I mean, like if we take mobility in general, for most people, some private car is like really great alternative. So for them to switch, it should be like a significant better. And currently, you know, if you take public transport and shared transportation network, is not the case for all. So I think like by combining the transport options, by incentivizing, by putting some more regulation in certain areas, I think we can get towards that. But it's definitely a journey, not like a one-time event.
Okay. Thank you very much for those final words, Tautvides. Sami, thanks for joining us. Marti, thanks as well. Time was running, and we could discuss this for a very long time, but thank you for having been there. Before I hand over to Danielle for the conclusion, I would just like to throw a last poll at our audience. On a scale of 1 to 10, how convinced are you that MaaS will be adopted by cities across the world and will reshape the way we move in our cities? So that will be my final note. Thank you very much for having listened. Thank you to all the speakers. And I now hand over to Danielle Serra, who is Managing Director at Innovation Hub South, EIT Urban Mobility. Danielle, over to you.
Hi, Jean-Paul. How are you? Thank you. I will try to be shorter because I think we are running out of time. First, I want to thank to all the audience. I think we got an incredible number of 344 registration for this today event. And also I want to thank to all the panelists for the great contributions. We have seen today, especially our third panelists, how they highlight that we need a governance model where customer could choose the right mobility service. I think we need to have always a sustainable and accessible transport systems, and the governance model should facilitate that, as Pia highlighted. I think the cooperation is a key point. And yes, in the second panel with the data sharing ecosystem that I think I pushed by the European Parliament, we should have a user-centric approach again. And as you said, I like this word that the data is the blood of mobility, and I think it will be very important in the coming years. Finally, our cities' transport authorities need to press hard on pilots. We have seen exciting examples today, and I think the cooperation is a key element on that. And finally, the COVID recovery will need more efficient, reliable, safer mobility. And in these COVID days, due to the restriction in our public transport capacity, demand and offer are usually unbalanced, we will need a more optimized public transport. And I think MaaS could provide that. For that reason, I think public sector need to push for fast integration of MaaS, and cooperate between public-private will be needed, and so a leadership between public and private sector. I think in the EIT Urban Mobility, we have most of the innovative cities, and some of them have been mentioned today and have participated today. And I think, as Laia said, we can push forward MaaS in Europe from the EIT Urban Mobility. As I want to announce that our 6th mobility talk that will take place on the 21st of October and will take a very exciting topic that will be citizen engagement. And finally, we are preparing our flagship event, the EIT Mobility Summit, that this year will take place between the 9th and 10th of December. Keep updated and keep healthy. And thank you so much for your participation.